go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteousness and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Amen.
There are times when it's worthwhile to figure out what Jesus didn't mean. A woman read ahead as she was going through this text that we had read and was troubled by the phrase, "Do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." It wasn't that she didn't give to those in need. Her problem was that she was giving so much away that she barely had enough left for herself and her family. Clearly, she wanted to show love, but she was afraid that she was misunderstanding something. So first we need to deal with what Jesus didn't mean. So what didn't Jesus mean? Did Jesus mean for us to give to everybody? Well, there are certain priorities in giving. For example, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially his immediate family, he has or she has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. 1 Timothy 5:8. So that's one of the first priorities as a believer. Don't give what is sacred to the dogs, or cast your pearls before swine. There are certain people that you know are going to abuse and mistrust or misuse your gift, and so you need to be careful about giving to them. Several years ago, a congregation had a regular attender at worship who was kind of down on his luck. Repeatedly, the congregation would help him out with financial gifts because he was part of their church family. Then it became known that he was visiting one of the local corn shops in the area, and it was apparent that their financial gifts were going toward supporting his habit, and they changed how they helped. So then, did Jesus mean that we shouldn't resist evil at all? There are other scriptures that show us that this may be an oversimplification. For example, Jesus cleared the temple courts, remember? There were probably no more striking sight than when Jesus overturned the tables of the marketers in the temple twice. What was he doing? He was resisting the evil of men within a sacred setting. Proverbs 25:26 declares that, like a muddied spring or a polluted well, is a righteous man who gives away to the wicked. So the lesson here is there are times when we need to confront and resist evil. In Romans 13:1 following, even tells us one of the ways that we can resist evil: through government. No, Jesus wasn't talking about walking away from evil. He was not talking about the idea that we shouldn't oppose all evil. Rather, he was addressing the way we should deal with personal confrontations. Note the emphasis: strikes you, sues you, forces you. These were incidents where personal space is invaded by others who made us mad. In those settings, our temptation is to strike back and return blow for blow. Jesus was addressing, you could say, the fairness doctrine. Tell me, if you enter a restaurant, what do you do when the waitress doesn't bring you an item that you had paid for? You might complain, talk to the manager, or at the very least, not leave a tip. We expect to get what we pay for, right? And pay for what we get. We tip in accordance with what the waitress deserves, or waiter. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Fair is fair. You tell me what's fair. If someone strikes you, what should you do? Or more honestly, what do you do, or what you want to do? You want to hit them back, don't you? It's only right, isn't it? I think I shared this story about when I was in high school. We played the game of dodgeball in a school gym, and it had its own set of rules that everyone seemed to be ignoring, such as when the ball rolled up along the bleachers where all of the people that were out were sitting, the ball really shouldn't be kicked back to your own team. But everybody did it anyway. So including me. One time when I did that, another boy named John got mad and threw the ball as hard as he could and hit me. But I managed to raise my hands, but it did end up jamming two of my fingers in the process. So John had turned away, satisfied he had proven his point, but I hadn't proved mine yet. I jumped up from the bleachers, ran over to him and bumped him with the shoulder on the right, turned around and decked him with a left. Everybody stood still. John sat disbelieving on the floor. I stood seething over him, and everyone else was silently choosing up sides in their minds. I don't think I have done well in the tally, though, because John was a fairly well-liked kid, and I was a nerdy audiovisual guy. It could have turned into a free-for-all. Then John did something I never expected, and something that changed my attitude toward fighting forever. He got up, you could say dusted off, and walked away. Nobody did that. It wasn't reasonable. It wasn't logical. But John proved himself to be the better man because he put into practice something of the principle that Jesus taught so long ago. Jesus was not saying that we shouldn't oppose evil in our world. Jesus was talking about our personal slights and injuries. He used two incidents to kind of resonate well in the minds of his listeners. First one, if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let them have your cloak as well. He's saying when we're sued for damages or child support, we should resist the temptation to think, I'll pay only what I have to, and I'll do it grudgingly. No, we should pay what's expected, and then a little more. The second incident, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. I've read that in the day, Roman soldiers could require people to be subjected in lands to carry their packs for them. In fact, it was just stated that if a Roman soldier asked you, you were required to carry the pack at least 1 mile. So after your obligation was met, you could, walk away. Since Jews hated the Romans anyway, this was a galling command, and the victims would complain and they would grumble the whole way. And Jesus was telling his followers, you may have to carry a pack for 1 mile, but if you are my disciples, you should gladly carry the pack for another. Why? Why would I give up my tunic to someone who obviously doesn't like me? And why would I carry an unjust load an extra mile? Because as followers of Christ, we're not called to fairness, we're called to righteousness. We're called to service. We're called to ministry. I once heard the true story of a man who embezzled $27,000 from a partner that he had with a Christian couple. That partnership they became embittered, couldn't sleep well at night, and were so troubled that they approached their minister asking what they should do. Well, their preacher advised them to find a way to invest in their former partner. So after prayer and discussion, they decided that they would find the financial need that he had and meet it. He learned that he had more needs. He needed $3,000 or so, and they gave that sum to him. Immediately, the wife began to sleep better and bitterness left them. The couple later explained how they now believe God has begun compensating them financially because of their faithfulness in this. If you love only those who love you, what reward will you get? Jesus asked. But there's something more than a reward involved here. Jesus said we are to love and pray for our enemies, that you may be sons and daughters of your Father which is in heaven. How many of you are God's children? Hopefully all of you. We are God's children. Why? Because we decided long ago that we loved him and wanted to be like him. But how do I become like him? How do you become like him? By copying the mercy that he has given us. Ephesians 2, 3, and 4 tells us, like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God in his great mercy made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. One of the most incredible stories of forgiveness I've ever heard comes out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a few years ago. Tom McGee was a young man who went out for a night of partying and carousing. He got drunk and ran head-on into a car driven by a young man named Ted Morris. He killed Ted Morris instantly while driving under the influence of alcohol. And this wasn't the first time that he had been arrested for drunk driving. So Tom McGee was put on trial for manslaughter, found guilty and sentenced to a term of several years in prison. But the prison was crowded, and the prisoners were being given early paroles. So Tom McGee actually spent only a few months in prison before he was released on parole. But he evidently hadn't learned his lesson, for it wasn't long until he was arrested again for drunk driving. So his parole was, of course, revoked, and he was sent back to complete his prison sentence. Jack Morris, the victim's father, visited Tom McGee in prison. After visiting several times, he started taking cookies that his wife Elizabeth had baked for him, and they became friends. Finally, Tom McGee was released from prison, but he had no place to go. So Jack and Elizabeth Morris invited him into their home and gave him a place to stay. They provided the means by which he could receive an education and helped him find a job. They were members of a Church of Christ in Tulsa, so they took him to church with them, where Tom McGee accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, and he was baptized for the remission of his sins. Later in the news, it came out that Jack and Elizabeth had formally adopted Tom and made him their son. When Elizabeth and Jack Morris die, Tom McGee will inherit whatever they have accumulated in this life. Now that's forgiveness, an incredible story of forgiveness. Once there was also a little girl who had a very large doll collection who was all heaped over her bed. There was a guest in her room one day and asked her, "Do you love dolls?" Then the tender, loving care, she spread all the doll collection for the guests to inspect them and to admire them. And the guest asked her, "Which doll do you love the most?" She hesitated and said, "Promise not to laugh if I tell you." He promised. She picked up a rag doll with a broken nose, whose hair was mostly coming off. One arm and leg were missing. "This is the one." "Why?" the visitor asked. "Because if I didn't love this one, nobody else would." woman once who wrote in the publication Pulpit House to explain the miraculous lesson her family experienced. She told about it. During one of their family Bible readings, as new Christians, they ran across a verse, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him." It's from Romans 12:20. She wrote about her sons, 7 and 10 at the time. They were especially puzzled. Why should you feed your enemy? They wondered. My husband and I wondered too, but the only answer John could give was to give the boys was supposed to be because God said so. They wondered. My husband and I wondered too, but the only answer he could give was, we're supposed to. It never occurred to us that we should learn why. Day after day, John Jr. came home from school complaining about a classmate who sat behind him in 5th grade. "Bob keeps jabbing me when Miss Smith isn't looking. One of those days when we're out on the playground, I'm going to jab him back," he said. I was ready to go down to school and jab Bob myself, the mother thought. Obviously the boy was a brat. Besides, why wasn't Mrs. Smith doing a better job at seeing what was going on with the kids? I'd better give her an oral jab too at the same time. I was still fuming over this injustice to John Jr. when his 7-year-old brother spoke up. "Maybe you should feed his enemy. Maybe you should do that." The three of us were kind of startled. None of us was sure that this was enemy business. It didn't seem that an enemy would be in the 5th grade. An enemy was